Thank you, everyone, for inviting me today. At a time when record offices around the country are dealing with financial difficulties, striving to continue to prove their worth to council and central government funders, and looking for new ways to engage with a wide variety of audiences, simultaneously, archival material has never been more popular. The seemingly inexorable rise of feeds offering photographs from the past has shown archival material to be of acute interest to millions of social media users worldwide. The Retronaut, for example, has a following of over 100,000 on Twitter, and History and Pics broadcast to almost 2 million people. Each provides photographs of a combination of interesting documents, celebrities as youngsters, peculiar incidents, and other miscellanea, allowing the follower an uncomplicated and unquestioned representation of the past, the possibility of enjoying a view of the past without having to enter into the complicated and messy study of history. Indeed, the backlash is well underway. The feeds I've mentioned have been variously accused of being inaccurate, of having failed to adequately reference material or provide any relevant context, and of having willfully used photographs without acknowledging copyright. And yet, do any of these accusations matter? Is the image, the object, or indeed the follower the only thing that matters? Or can I stand in front of a room of archivists and historians and other professionals and claim that in order to maintain and create a robust and substantial social media presence, we have to ignore citation or referencing principles? Well, not quite, but I will attempt to explain the thinking behind these feeds, their subsequent popularity, and consider how much energy archives could and should expend engaging in a format which is, by the person behind the Retronaut's own admission, arguably shallow. By way of a comparison of sorts, I will also describe the National Archives UK War Cabinet Twitter feed and how we attempted to represent material during the 70th anniversary of D-Day in June. The Retronaut, created by Chris Wilde, has been running since 2009 and rapidly grew a large following, intrigued by the selection of often unusual and always thoughtfully chosen capsules. At an event at Northumbria University earlier this year, Wilde spoke about his aims for the feed, namely that the closest he could come to fulfilling his childhood dream of travelling through time would be this activity, by creating an environment where, as is claimed on the website, another version of now is shown. Or, as Wilde repeated in Newcastle, images are chosen because they're likely to tear a hole in our collective map of time. Undoubtedly, to this end, the feed, and indeed the accompanying website, is successful. Some of the capsules selected are surprising and do, to some degree, skew our perception of time. One that I find particularly enjoyable is this, a selection of photographs from Imperial Russia just after the turn of the 20th century. The site of the Russian peasantry, of which one has read so much about, resplendent in colour, drawing out each tone of the girls' fabrics, the fabric in their dresses, allows us for perhaps a moment more to think about that section of society, and is particularly enlightening in view of the upheavals and horrors they would face in the next 3 decades. Wilde, however, has gone further than just create a successful Twitter feed and website. He's also developed a kind of philosophy underpinning the capsule creation. In addition to the desire to tear tiny holes in our perception of time, there's an unashamed declaration of disinterest in metadata. He's interested in data and wants our attention to be on the image or object, and a demand for people to not be afraid of their personal judgment. Quote, "It is better to ask for forgiveness than permission." Wilde himself used to work in the Museums, Libraries and Archives Council and felt that a great deal of interesting archival material just lay unused. The Retronaut created an opportunity to reach people who would not necessarily describe themselves as interested in history, let alone have set foot in an archive. An initialized formula also makes up part of his theory. Content should be seen, pictures of the language of the internet, should be positive, there should be some benefit to the user, they could be challenging, moving, so forth. It should be easy, simple to understand, emotive and disruptive. It's this final element, that of disruption, that is most important to Wilde, and what I find most interesting too. That the images chosen counter how most people might consider the past is understood when we consider the aims of the feed. However, it's the choice of a word borrowed from the language of the internet startup that in some way signifies some of the less readily vocalized aims of the feed. He's described this as an attempt to bring the lessons of retail into the archive sector. And this is reflected in the successful publication of a book and the investors that have financed the website. Other feeds have taken up the baton, but without necessarily the underpinning theory. History in Pics, for example, has almost 2 million followers and routinely achieves the kind of social media imprint that journalists, institutions, and even some celebrities could only dream of, let alone the humble archive. However, it does not take a great deal of searching to locate blog posts and online articles eviscerating such feeds. One such post by Sarah Werner of the Folger Shakespeare Library in Washington draws attention to the lack of respect for metadata and historical accuracy, and what she sees as the superficial nature of some of the content. Matt Novak in the Paleo Future blog has seemingly taken great pleasure in uncovering the, quote, total lies shared by such feeds. Meanwhile, History in Pics goes from strength to strength, with its teenage creators showing no inclination to guilt over their ability to monetize their traffic. And the anger generated by such feeds is perhaps understandable and something that I'd have to explain here less maybe than anywhere else. Those who work in sectors that value historical accuracy and appropriate recognition, context, etc., are perhaps likely to become frustrated by such blatant disregard for these principles, especially when viewed in the light of the searing popularity of these feeds. So what role can archives play, seeing as it would be difficult to influence the millions of followers, especially those disinterested in historical study and archival practice? The UK Wall Cabinet feed was created by Joe Pugh in the Education Department of the National Archives and has been running since 2010. It uses Cabinet conclusions and memoranda available to download via the Cabinet Papers website and narrates an as-live story of the Second World War 70 years on. And after lying dormant for a year when Joe left his post, it was revived in October 2013 and is now run by a group of contributors in the Advice and Records Knowledge Department. By linking to papers which can be downloaded by members of the public, we have been able to tell the story of the decision-making process during the war, all the while pointing to the documentary evidence held at the National Archives. As we approached the 70th anniversary of D-Day, we were well aware that simply telling the story of the Normandy landings from the perspective of the Cabinet war rooms would be insufficient. We therefore embarked on an attempt to draw together other material in our collection, Army war diaries, RAF squadron records, Royal Navy logs, and even cipher intercepts from German Army communications to create a more complete picture of the landings. And you can see the tweets from the anniversary week on that Story 5 page. The feed's followership increased from around 11,000 to roughly 13,500 over the course of a matter of hours. And the graph shows this quite starkly. However, there was an understanding that we as a group knew that this was simply unsustainable and a one-off. Manually digitizing documents, cropping and resizing images, and the process of queuing up the tweets was simply time-consuming. Coupled with that was an acute awareness that as a feed from the National Archives, accuracy was of paramount importance. So there's an extra level of work there. And finally, the difficulty of adequately representing references when restricted to 140 character limits made this another challenge. We overcame this by including the references on the pages which hosted the images themselves. Our experiences were reflective of what I see as the main challenges facing archives who wish to engage in social media activity of this sort. First, we simply cannot afford to be guilty of the accusations of inaccuracy directed towards the likes of the Retronaut and History in Pics. Not only would this demonstrate a degree of carelessness and a lack of knowledge in our collections, but it would also diminish trust in those of us engaged with providing records advice to researchers. Second, we may not want to publish online without adequate referencing. Doing so, for UK War Cabinet, for example, would lose the unique element that separates our feed from other similar ones, namely that link to documentary evidence. At the same time, this would not encourage people to use those documents or reuse the images themselves, in an appropriate way, of course, which would surely be the point of engaging online in the first place. Here we've got an example of an image of, quote, suffragettes as published by the old PICS archive feed. And I'll show you in a moment the image, an entry from our image library from which the copies can be purchased of Annie Kelly and Christabel Pankhurst, and the document reference copy 1/494. By providing the reference, this enables interested people to find the original document and, of course, the opportunity to buy copies. Third and finally, locating appropriate content remains the biggest challenge. And this is perhaps manageable when a group of colleagues decide to engage in a relatively short project, like the D-Day anniversary. But for anything more substantial or lengthy, this could quickly become problematic. And this is particularly pertinent when considering those archives with smaller workforces and the financial pressures that have been mentioned already this morning. Staff simply would not have the time to root through documents looking for content which could translate well online. Yet engagement online remains an excellent way to reach new audiences and share eye-catching content, which suddenly reveals social media engagement to be something of a double-edged sword. So what should archives do? I think it could be summarised by my own initialisation: slow. Seen, yes, the pictures may be the language of the internet, but are you as an institution seen? Is it possible to mark the image with a reference simply and efficiently? Don't forget, it's very easy for those images to become divorced from the tweet or blog that they're originally linked to, as you could see with the suffragettes. Will your collection gain recognition? Locate. How will you find the interesting content? Can you use volunteers or even the researchers in your reading room to help you find content that would translate successfully online? Is there a formula that you can use internally to identify shareable images in your collection, or other content for that matter? Organize. Do you have an organized publication process that could work simply? If you don't have a dedicated web team, do you at least have a member of staff confident using social media who could engage with this? And finally, why and where? Why do you want to engage online? Is it to draw people on site, to try and conduct their own research, in which case a link to Discovery or an equivalent might be useful? Or is it just to show off a particular image, and in which case is a link required at all? And also consider which platform is most appropriate. Twitter is excellent for fast-moving engagement and for reaching wide audiences, but Pinterest might be better for a collection of images. And I'm going to finish with a plug as well. It should also be said that this is just one form of social media interaction. My colleague Tom White has published today research from the Archive Sector Development Department at the National Archives entitled Digital Services and Online Audiences. And this indicates quite how much local authority archives are engaging in social media. Roughly 46% of archives engage with audiences online via Facebook and Twitter, or Twitter. Quite how much that engagement takes the form of sharing archival media, archival material itself, as opposed to contacting potential audiences, is probably worth further study, or we may hear more about later. But this level of engagement does suggest that at least the archives possess the knowledge and the willingness to use such media. So there's a possibility of using this to grow and broaden audiences. Also, it'd be remiss of me not to mention the social media campaign ahead of Explore Your Archive in mid-November, including our first Thunderclap campaign. So follow @Explore Archives or visit exploreyourarchive.org. And also, I'm involved with another social media project called Unit War Diaries, which is using war diaries held at the National Archives and via Operation War Diary to tell a narrative of the First World War. In conclusion, though, while I recognise some of the frustrations directed towards the successful historical social media feeds, there are worthwhile practices that can be learnt from them. And rather than succumb to any anger or rejection of those feeds, we need to take time to consider that they have alighted on a successful format, and that if we in the archive sector wish to engage in a similar way, we may at least need to borrow or adapt some of those practices. Therefore, there is a tension between what it takes to create a global online phenomenon using archival material and what archives would expect to do as part of their online engagement. But as ever, this does create an opportunity, and there's a growing body of evidence of what works, so we can use that to engage more efficiently and creatively with our audiences in the future. Thank you very much.